to anyone. Good, welcome. We will start straight away. I think I will also, if you don't mind, I will mute you all while I give the talk, which will take about 20 minutes. You're all muted. And I'm sharing my screen. And I'm going straight into the history study group, the invasions of the Sea Peoples, which you may already know something about. Let's start by setting the scene. The Bronze Age began about 3300 BC, and it was a time of quite extraordinary peace. There was lots of trading going on. There were squabbles from time to time. For example, there was a little do called the Battle of Kadesh, when the Hittites decided to have a go at Canaan on the coast, and Egypt took exception to that. But that was settled quite well. Ramses did claim that he won, but that was just, he was just kidding, really, because we found the agreement in Hattusas, and the Hittites had recorded it onto tablets of Akkadian cuneiform, and therefore we knew that it was actually a draw. And we will go into tablets more later. Let's have a look. It was a time when everybody knew everybody. Trade was extremely amazingly useful, and in fact something that we haven't known for the last 10 years. But up to 10 years ago, we could have said that we had a globalized system of trade which worked, and everybody was prepared to get on, if not be totally friendly. But trade is trade. And this is one example you can see here of what it might have looked like. What did they trade in? Pretty nearly everything, really. Tin was extremely important because bronze to make your warriors' greaves and such would be 90% copper and 10% tin. And the tin came from Afghanistan, and sometimes even from Cornwall, but mostly from Afghanistan. That was the source. So it was a very widespread, very stable system of trade. All of that stopped suddenly, where normally, if you had 50 or so concubines, you could guarantee you had a surplus of daughters and sons. You could trade them off with other empires and give gifts of copper and, generally speaking, be polite to people. Suddenly it stopped. We had these separate civilizations consisting. There's a list here. I'm not going to read them out. You can read them for yourself, I think. But suddenly, the Sea Peoples arrived, a real menace. We will go into who they were later, just a few slides on. Two of them are fairly prominent. The Peliset on the left with his distinctive headgear, and the Shedden, who possibly came from Sardinia, but much more likely it is that they came from somewhere else, and they used Sardinia as a base. But they're very easily identifiable. One of the reasons being that they're very popular with war gamers who like to have figures and actually reenact the battles of the Sea Peoples. The information we get mostly comes from the funerary temple of Ramses III. There were two invasions of the Sea Peoples, the first in 2007 BC, And 30 years later, in 1177, bearing in mind that numbers go backwards if you're before the Christian era, we have Ramses III describing how he dealt with the second wave. This is part of a very much larger inscription on the wall of the funerary temple, a very much larger one. This is about a fifth or a sixth of the original. We can see at the bottom there the Egyptian army on the right, in their distinctive kilts, and the prisoners being shepherded and herded on the left. We'll meet the prisoners later. One of the reasons that Egypt was able to defeat the Sea Peoples was because they were not always in ships. They mostly landed and burnt cities and did all sorts of terrible things. But Egypt had the lightweight war chariot, which we could think of as a weapon of mass destruction. And that was of great help in defeating other forces which did not have or had not brought chariots. The Sherden probably based themselves in Sardinia because there is some evidence that they came from the north. And they weren't necessarily a homogeneous group, but they are fairly distinctive with their old helmets. Eventually, being defeated by the Egyptian army, they were led into captivity and probably became slaves. Not all of them. The Peliset that we know as the Philistines were actually settled. They were later, as it says here, relocated to Canaan to act as guardians of the Egyptian frontier. So they became a client kingdom of the Egyptian empire. But around that time, there was much more destruction than simply a battle along the coast of Asia Minor and Egypt. It affected practically everyone. And you can see from the number of destroyed cities, those red dots, that in fact there was much more going on than simply an invasion of a couple of dozen ships loaded with angry-looking pirates. This is a scene from about 1200 BC. At Medinet Habu, the sea battles are also depicted. Egypt had a fairly large navy, and it took to the sea. Most of the trade had been done, we believe, by the Minoans. They were the people who shipped everything around in the Mediterranean. And they dominated Mycenae. We shall see more of Mycenae later. The Sea Peoples, it turns out, were actually determined to settle. It was not simply a pirate raid and burn your cities, grab your slaves and run away again. They came to stay. And only the Peliset, the Philistines, were enabled to stay. The rest were eventually defeated. But the chaos that they caused was quite extraordinary. Here is some example of the invasions, the destruction of Ugarit, Canaan. Inland invasions would be the Peliset and the Sherden landing in Libya and, in fact, stirring up the Libyans to help them to defeat and encroach on the Egyptian empire. There were battles in the Delta, the Nile Delta. We know from evidence from the Egyptians. Mycenae was destroyed, and we know, we have some idea why. We will look at that in a minute. This is a rather noisy diagram, which I got from Eric Kline, Professor Eric Kline, who has a program called 1177, The Collapse of Civilization. I strongly recommend it. It's on YouTube. If you go to YouTube and just put in 1177, you will find it. It's an excellent program, more than an hour long, and it goes into full detail. And what I have done is I've just grabbed a few images here and there. Now, what may have caused it? Because it turns out that, in fact, the invasion of the sea peoples and landing in boats and burning and pillaging could very well be an effect and not a cause. The cause may lie elsewhere. And one of the theories is that there was a dry event over 300 years which caused widespread climate disruption. I'm sure you've heard that phrase before. And we have evidence for this, digging up pollen deposited in various sites. So a climate crisis, heating, the subsequent loss of wheat, corn, and everything that goes along with excessive heat. So people were starving. And we know that we have evidence for that too, because the tablets found at Hattusas tell the story of a great many cries for help between the kings of the various empires. Drought may have doomed the Bronze Age civilization. Here's a rather pretty picture of the Lion Gate at Mycenae. It's actually been titivated a bit, I think, because if we see the original, right, a letter from the Hittite king, a matter of life and death. Here is evidence of earthquake, and in fact, Mycenae also, here's the Lion Gate again, but this is what it looked like when it was excavated. And you can see that there is considerable slippage on the right-hand side, though that wall has been resurrected and made pretty for the tourists. But that is what it looked like when it was uncovered originally. And that is clear evidence of a slippage caused by an earthquake. Somebody switched on closed captioning, that's fine. Summing up, several separate civilizations were flourishing. And there is a list there. I will need you to read that. Now, I think we are entering a rather contentious point here. That was 3,200 years ago. And I think it is possible to claim that we are in the middle of something which is similar. As I said earlier, up to 10 or 15 years ago, we could claim that we had a stable relationship between the various countries of the world, and that is no longer the case. part of the problem, and a problem that will continue to grow, in most people's opinions, is a problem of heating. And it is my personal opinion that we have lost any chance we ever had of maintaining an increase of 1.5 degrees centigrade, and it will most certainly go up to 2 degrees centigrade. When that happens, we are going to find that more and more people wish to escape. These are the figures up to our year, 2022, and in fact, that is from September of this year. Whether we will maintain that trajectory, we don't know. I would have said we certainly will. And what it will look like in 2030, which is 8 years away, we do not know. Some of us will survive to see it, some won't. But it is my opinion that we are in for quite serious problems from the year 2030 onwards. Whether they can be related as being anything like the collapse of the Bronze Age, I don't know. I wouldn't like to guess. Perhaps we can discuss that at the end of this presentation, which is now. That was the end. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to invite you, if you like, to unmute yourself, ask a question, or make a comment. Robert.
Yeah, I have a query. You see, if you're saying that these enemies of civilization came from the north, which would suggest that they, had cavalry, but at some stage they must have acquired boats and the skills to fight with them. Yeah. So, this is what puzzles me, because they're taking on the Egyptians, who had maybe the best navy in the Mediterranean, or the Minoans, who had the best navy in the Mediterranean. So where would they have got the boat skills from, and the boats?
Well, I think we're talking about a time over 100, 200 years, and that would certainly be enough. It's possible that, in fact, they were Mycenaeans. For example, one of the things I decided not to touch on was the destruction of Ilios. We know it as Troy, but in fact, they called themselves the city of Ilios, and the Hittites knew them as the Wilusa, and they are certainly down in the list of people who were part of the sea people. So we don't know. There was plenty of time, Robert. Jeff, you have a hand up.
I do, thank you. Yeah, very interesting. And your sort of later analysis of present day, I also share your concerns. And not only do we have obviously climate change affecting large parts of the globe, we also have population increases also affecting parts of the globe where probably climate change is having a double whammy. So certainly parts of Africa are forecast to have large population increases. So we've just reached 7 billion, is it?
Yes.
And
8 billion.
8 billion, is it? Okay, well, the next billion, I think, is due to come from probably large parts of Africa. And climate change is going to have quite an impact there. So I think we have a double whammy heading our way across the globe, unfortunately.
Be interesting to have another point of view, perhaps. Are we being too pessimistic? No, says Barry. And Wendy isn't quite sure either. Yes, Barry.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in ancient history, so I can't claim that this position is valid. But I imagine that in those days, if particular groups of people were experiencing hardship for whatever reason, natural or earthquakes or crop failures or drought or whatever, they would be wanting to move, but pretty much anywhere but here, anywhere but where they are, just to get away from the hardship and find somewhere else. So you've got like a push factor. But in today's world, you haven't just got a push factor, which is getting away from a bad situation that you're in, but a pull factor as well, which is seeing what's going on in other countries and thinking, oh, I want to be there. So I think what the situation that may arise today may be even more calamitous than what would have happened in historic times.
Yes, I think I agree.
I think the other point is that the numbers of people who have got the pull factor or feel the pull factor will swamp the ones who, like us, have what they want. I mean, the numbers at the moment crossing the channel are relatively small, and we're just about able to cope. But you can imagine those numbers swelling massively, and certainly other European countries have taken in or had to deal with significantly larger numbers than we have.
I'd like to point out personally that, in fact, I would welcome the numbers that are actually coming in now. I may not be quite so positive, should I happen, if I have some chance to last to 2030. Because if we can see what the trajectory is of the numbers crossing in little rubber dinghies, but they are only little rubber dinghies at the moment. By 2030, that will have changed, I suspect. More comments or questions?
I don't think that's too much of a problem at the moment, because we have labour shortages here, and we badly need more people coming in anyway.
Yes. Yes, so provided there's a certain trade-off, then that's fine. It's when it reaches the point where it's excessive, then perhaps we might start using the word invasion, but not yet. That's my view.
Of course, the Home Secretary has already used the word invasion and has got slapped over the wrists for it. So,
Suella Braverman, yes.
Yes.
Of course. Well, that was incautious of her.
Yes.
But you have to be very careful these days which words you use. I had a phone call not long ago where I used the word elderly, and the woman on the other end said, "Don't use that word anymore." I won't repeat what I said.
So going back to the
Yes.
historical context.
Donald,
Sorry.
Donald, please.
Yeah, I was just going to comment. Thanks very much, Tom. That was, of course, fascinating as ever. You always have a slightly unusual elliptical spin on these things, but the facts of history are awkward. I'm always saying that, and they don't always fit the pattern we would like them to fit. So whether we're pessimistic or not, I think it's probably irrelevant. It's going to happen or it's not going to happen. My question is, do we ever learn from history, or are we condemned to repeat it all the time? And I know it's an old question, but it seems to be a perennial one.
It's something about the nature of individual power. When a leader surrounds him or herself with people who can only say yes, then that's fatal. It's self-feeding and self-defeating, because you don't hear the truth anymore. And that is what's happening with Russia, for example, which has been relatively stable for some years, and now it has a leader who has removed anybody that might pose a problem to him. Jeff has his hand up, and Richard after him.
Yes, thank you. I was just going back to the historical context. So we had the breakdown, as you call it. How long did that last, and what made it improve?
I don't have an answer to that.
Okay.
Any takers? No. Sorry, we'll have to put that to one side, Jeff.
No
Richard,
problem.
you've
No
got your
problem.
hand up.
Yeah, I'd like to take a cynical view on that. That's a very interesting question, whether we learn from history. And it seems in many, many cases that we don't. We repeat the same mistakes. So I've got a pretty cynical view about that. And also, I'd like to ask about the historical thing. Why didn't the sea people create their own empire? They didn't have any settlements apart from the Philistines.
Well, they were a very mixed bunch, Richard.
Mm.
I have a list here in front of me, or nearly in front of me. They were the Denyen, the Ekwesh, the Lucca, the Peliset, the Chekalesh, the Shurden, the Teresh, the Jekka, and the Weshesh.
Oh, there's a lot of them.
A lot of them, yeah.
Mm.
And they were all probably different, with different sorts of boats and different sorts of headgear and heaven knows what.
So
So
it
it was a
wasn't.
coalition. It was a coalition. And
Oh,
that
right.
is why
Yeah.
we use the word peoples instead of
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
In the plural. Questions and comments? Yes, Richard. If you'd unmute yourself first.
No, I've just
There we
spoken.
go.
There's someone else.
Two questions, if I may. One is, were the sea peoples still Bronze Age, as it were, or were they on the edge of becoming Iron Age?
By the end of their defeat, Richard, the Bronze Age did not exist.
Right.
One of the reasons is that the Hittites were already smelting iron. And it is at this point the transition from Bronze Age empires to the Iron Age, the whole nature of warfare changes, and the whole nature of the empires changes, because it now becomes based on villages and towns rather than empires and the larger view, the larger control. Trade more or less disappeared. You didn't need tin, you didn't need copper. Iron was very plentiful and could be easily smelted.
So, I mean, could that be as significant a factor as the technological shift, if you like, rather than either the invasion military side of it and or climate effects of drought, etc.? Is it another possible factor, or don't the dates really line up?
Yes, that's an interesting question. Of course, we're living in an age where new technology is accelerating rather than decelerating. It's certainly not going away, but it depends what sort of technology we're using. There are a lot of advances in medical technology, as Barry, I'm sure, would confirm. But my particular interest happens to be in artificial intelligence and robotics, and it seems to me that that is going to make a tremendous difference. The Chinese are putting twice as much money in as the Americans are into artificial intelligence, but that's a separate subject, I think.
And a second question was, obviously this only really affected the Mediterranean and its wider surroundings. I mean, I guess as far as Babylonia, etc. What sort of population were we talking about in that fraction of the world? You know, I guess the Indian, Chinese civilizations went on largely unaffected, so their, I don't know, millions, whatever, were carried on. What about the Western side of things?
Well, the changes as far as India is concerned are that the Harappan civilization,
Right.
Mohenjo-daro, had already disappeared by 1500 BCE. And in fact, there were all sorts of problems which have not been resolved really. We don't really know, but there is a possibility of Indo-Aryan invasions into India, largely based on differences between the two language families, one being Indo-European and the other one being a different sort. The four languages of the South are entirely different from the Indo-European language.
Thank you. Thank you.
Telugu, what are they? Telugu, Tamil, Malayalam, and Kannada are four major languages in the South. None of them has any bearing at all or place in the Indo-European family. Right, well, we've come to a significant point, I think, unless there are more comments and questions. I am going to close.
Robert.
Yes, Robert.
Yeah, I mean, I come back to this trade. You say that trade stops, but I think every state has to trade. You know, countries have surpluses, some countries have deficits. So you can either move into a situation of trade, or you can have like a Viking culture, which would be theft, because it's always going to be easier to steal than to work, right? So the Viking culture was based on, you know, basically slave trading. Yeah.
Yes.
You know, so I'm saying that, yeah, but you know, you can only go thieving from people who've got something. You can't just keep robbing the same person day after day. Yeah.
But certainly we can see over 1,000 years that there was a definite decay. What we are looking at now, the collapse of the Bronze Age, is what is now called the Dark Ages. The Greek, the Mediterranean Dark Ages. And I think that that's a realistic way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for attending.
Thank you, Tom.
Forward to it. To see
Thank you,
you
Tom.
next time.
Thanks, Tom.
It's interesting. Thank you.
Very
Good.
interesting.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank
I will
you.
end this meeting and hope to see you again soon.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Thanks,
Goodbye.
Tom.